Tom walked into the airport, clutching his small backpack. He had been saving for months to afford this flight, one that would take him to see his sick mother. Every dollar mattered. As he checked in, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had booked an economy-class seat, nothing fancy, just enough to get him where he needed to be. Meanwhile, a wealthy businessman, Mr. Reynolds, strutted through the airport, carrying nothing but an expensive briefcase. He had taken flights more times than he could count. To him, flying was a routine, not a privilege. Tom reached the gate, boarding pass in hand. The plane was crowded, filled with passengers settling into their seats. He carefully placed his bag in the overhead compartment and was about to sit when he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Excuse me," Mr. Reynolds said, standing with his arms crossed. "I believe that's my seat." Tom blinked in confusion, looking at his ticket. "No, sir, this is my seat, 22A. Mr. Reynolds sighed impatiently. "There must be a mistake." A flight attendant approached, checking both tickets. She smiled politely. "Sir, your seat is actually further back. 27C. Mr. Reynolds frowned. "That can't be right. I specifically booked a better seat. I have an important meeting after this flight. I need to be comfortable." Tom hesitated, unsure what to do. The flight attendant repeated herself, but Mr. Reynolds wasn't backing down. Mr. Reynolds narrowed his eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "I don't think you understand," he said, turning to the flight attendant. "I fly all the time. I always sit near the front. I cannot be stuck in some cramped seat in the back." The flight attendant remained professional. "Sir, I checked both tickets. This seat belongs to him." Tom shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want to cause trouble. He just wanted to sit down, close his eyes, and make it through the flight. Mr. Reynolds, however, had other plans. "Look, the kid can take my seat. It's still in economy. He'll be fine." Tom's mouth opened slightly in shock. "But I paid for this seat." Mr. Reynolds let out a small chuckle, as if he found Tom's words amusing. "I'm sure it wasn't much more than my seat. Just take mine and let's get this over with." Passengers nearby started noticing the situation. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged glances, silently judging. The flight attendant tried again. "Sir, we cannot force him to switch seats with you." Mr. Reynolds smirked. "I'm sure he doesn't mind, right, kid?" Tom hesitated. He did mind. But looking around, he saw the exhaustion on the flight attendant's face, the eyes of other passengers waiting for a resolution. He felt small. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "It's fine." The flight attendant looked regretful, but didn't push further. Mr. Reynolds smiled, satisfied, and settled into Tom's seat, as if it had always belonged to him. Tom grabbed his bag and walked toward the back of the plane, his heart sinking. As Tom made his way toward the back, he could feel the stares of other passengers. Some looked sympathetic, others avoided eye contact. No one said a word. The flight attendant who had handled the situation sighed, her professionalism slipping for just a second. She turned to another crew member. "I hate when people pull this kind of stunt." Her colleague nodded. "We should have pushed back harder." She exhaled sharply. The poor guy didn't want to make a scene. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his stolen seat, stretching his legs as if he had won a battle. He rang the service bell almost immediately. When the flight attendant approached, he didn't even look up. "I'll take a scotch." "Neat," he said. She forced a smile. "We're still boarding, sir. Drinks will be served later." Mr. Reynolds sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Fine." At the back of the plane, Tom squeezed into seat 27C. It was next to the restrooms, and the smell wasn't pleasant. The seat was smaller, and his knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of him. He adjusted his backpack under his feet and exhaled. A young woman sitting beside him whispered, "That was really unfair." Tom gave her a small smile. "It's okay." But it wasn't. A few rows ahead, a mother and her young son had witnessed everything. The boy frowned. "Mom, why did that man take his seat?" She shushed him softly, but her expression was tight. "Some people think they're more important than others," she murmured. The plane continued to board, the situation seemingly forgotten. But the flight crew hadn't. One of the attendants discreetly stepped into the cockpit and spoke with the pilot. After a brief conversation, the pilot nodded. His expression didn't change, but there was something sharp in his eyes. The door to the cockpit closed again. Back in seat 27C, Tom stared out the window, pretending not to care. But something was about to happen. And this time, it wouldn't be in Mr. Reynolds' favor. The plane was now fully boarded, and the final announcements began. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, securing overhead bins and ensuring everyone had their seatbelts fastened. Tom sat quietly in his new seat, staring out the window. His stomach felt heavy, but he told himself it wasn't a big deal. He just wanted to get through the flight. Up front, Mr. Reynolds seemed completely unbothered. He leaned back in his seat, checking his watch. Every now and then he glanced around, making sure everyone saw how comfortably he was sitting. A few rows ahead, the little boy from earlier spoke up again. "Mom, why did the mean man take that guy's seat?" His mother hushed him again, but she looked irritated. She wasn't the only one. Other passengers were clearly uncomfortable. They had seen what happened, and while no one wanted to cause a scene, the unfairness of it lingered. A flight attendant passed by Tom's row and gave him a small smile, almost apologetic. Tom just nodded in return. Then a man sitting across the aisle suddenly muttered, "Disgusting." Tom looked over. The man was staring at Mr. Reynolds. He wasn't alone. A few other passengers were side-eyeing the businessman, whispering among themselves. Mr. Reynolds, of course, noticed. He frowned, shifting slightly in his seat. He wasn't used to this. He was used to admiration, not quiet judgment. Still, he shook it off and rang the service button again. "Miss," he called out as a flight attendant approached. "I'd like that drink now." She nodded but didn't move as quickly as before. There was a shift in the air, a quiet but growing tension. Tom didn't know it yet, but something was happening, and soon, everyone on the plane would witness it. The plane had been in the air for about an hour when a soft chime rang through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "I hope you're all having a comfortable flight. I wanted to take a moment to speak about something important." Passengers perked up, curious. It wasn't often that the captain spoke outside of the usual flight updates. "Air travel is more than just getting from one place to another," he continued. "It's a shared experience, a place where people from all walks of life come together, and in that, we value fairness and respect." Some passengers exchanged glances. The words felt deliberate. "In this cabin, we treat everyone with the dignity they deserve," the captain said. "We do not judge people by their wealth, status, or importance outside this plane, because in the air, we are all the same." Mr. Reynolds stiffened. He suddenly had a very bad feeling about this. Earlier today, a passenger was unfairly pressured into giving up his rightful seat, the captain continued. "That is not the kind of experience we want on our flights." Now, there was no question about it. He was talking about Tom. Passengers started murmuring. Some smirked, others nodded. Mr. Reynolds shifted in his seat, gripping the armrest. His face turned red. The captain wasn't done. "We take these matters seriously, and while we cannot undo what happened, we can ensure fairness moving forward." A short silence. Then, "With that in mind, I would like to invite Mr. Tom to move to first class for the remainder of the flight, as a token of our appreciation." The cabin erupted in whispers. Tom's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" A flight attendant appeared beside him, smiling warmly. "Sir, if you'll come with me, we have a seat waiting for you." Tom hesitated, still processing what just happened. But the passengers around him were already encouraging him. "Go on, man, you deserve it. That's how you handle things." "About time." Tom finally stood, still in disbelief. As he walked up the aisle, passengers clapped, some even cheered softly. But not Mr. Reynolds. He sat frozen in his stolen seat, humiliated. Tom walked slowly toward the front of the plane, his heart pounding. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. People clapped, some nodding at him with approval, a few even smiled warmly. The flight attendant led him past the dividing curtain into first class. It was like stepping into another world, wider seats, extra legroom, plush cushions. The air even smelled different. "Right this way, sir," the flight attendant said, gesturing to an open seat near the window. Tom hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to." She smiled. "Absolutely, this is for you." Slowly, Tom lowered himself into the seat. It was the most comfortable chair he had ever sat in. A different flight attendant approached. "Would you like a drink, sir?" Tom blinked. Just water is fine." She nodded, quickly returning with a glass of chilled water on a small tray. Meanwhile, back in economy class, Mr. Reynolds sat in stunned silence. He could feel the eyes on him. He had gotten his way earlier, but now he had lost, and this time everyone knew it. A man across the aisle chuckled. Well, that backfired. The little boy from earlier grinned at his mother. Mom, the nice man got a better seat. She smiled. Yes, sweetie. Sometimes things work out the way they should. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat and stared straight ahead, pretending not to hear any of it. His face was red and his jaw was tight. He no longer looked confident. He looked embarrassed. Meanwhile, in first class, Tom took a deep breath and let himself relax for the first time. For the first time in hours, he felt valued. And for the first time ever, Mr. Reynolds had been put in his place. The plane continued its smooth journey through the sky, but the energy in the cabin had completely shifted. Tom sat comfortably in first class, sipping his water, still processing everything that had just happened. He never expected kindness from strangers, especially not like this. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. Would you like anything else, Mr. Tom? A meal? A blanket? Tom shook his head, still overwhelmed. No, thank you. This is more than enough. Meanwhile, back in economy, Mr. Reynolds was stiff in his seat. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, even if no one said a word. A man sitting across from him smirked. Guess money doesn't always buy respect, huh? Mr. Reynolds clenched his jaw. He didn't respond. He just stared at the seat in front of him, wishing the flight would end already. Further down the aisle, the little boy who had been watching everything grinned at his mother. Mom, did you see? The good guy got the best seat. She smiled, running a hand through his hair. Yes, honey, because he deserved it. Mr. Reynolds heard them. His face burned with humiliation, but there was nothing he could do now. The rest of the flight continued peacefully. The passengers were friendlier, the flight attendants more at ease. It was as if a weight had been lifted. Tom leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window. He thought about his mother, about how worried he had been before the flight, and about how this small act of fairness had restored something in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the world wasn't always against him. And for Mr. Reynolds, he learned that status and money didn't always win. Sometimes doing the right thing did.